It was after 11 p.m. on January 30th, 2012, when Billy Payne Jr. got a call. A buddy of his wanted to come to his house in Mountain City, Tennessee to buy some drugs. But Billy didn't appreciate getting that call. Sure, Billy was a small-time drug dealer, but he wasn't the crazy bachelor he used to be a few years earlier. He was 36, and he had a family now, including a 6-month-old son who had finally fallen asleep. And so the last thing Billy needed was a late-night visitor to wake the baby up again. So, at 11:30, he texted his friend saying they couldn't meet up. He explained he had to be up early in the morning for his job at the thread factory, and so he needed some rest. His friend would just have to get his pills somewhere else. But as much as this call was annoying because it was inconveniencing, the truth was Billy was actually in the process of trying to leave his drug-abusing past behind. Billy had always been the life of the party in his small town. He was the guy who always had a beer in his hand and an endless parade of girlfriends. He drove a Mustang and bragged about going to Las Vegas for the weekend. His cousin, Jaime Kurd, described Billy as being a man with caviar tastes on a working man's budget. But all that high living had a price. Billy had developed a nasty addiction to opioid painkillers, an addiction that he supported in part by selling opioids himself. Billy knew he'd made his share of mistakes in his life, including the fact that he had a young son in Florida that he never saw, but his opioid addiction was the worst. It clouded his judgment, it sucked up his money, and always left him feeling desperate for more. After Billy finished texting his friend, telling him not to come over, he went to go peek in on his baby, Tyler, who was all tucked into his crib. Billy smiled at the baby, and then he headed down the hall to join his girlfriend, Billie Jean Hayworth, in bed. Billie Jean was 13 years younger than Billy, and she was slender and pretty, with short brown hair. She was also an outdoorsy Tennessee girl who loved nothing better than fishing, hiking, and camping. Billy had had his eye on Billie Jean from the moment she had come to work on the cleaning crew at the thread factory 3 years earlier. And soon after they had met, the two started spending all their time together. By 2010, Billy had invited Billie Jean to move into the small one-bathroom house that he shared with his father. By 2011, Billie Jean was pregnant with Billy's child. That same year, Billy had begun going religiously to an opioid treatment center and taking a prescription drug to control his cravings. And while the new year was still only a few weeks old, Billy still had a feeling that this year, 2012, would be the year he could finally start calling himself a former opioid addict. Billy felt grateful as he looked down at his sleeping girlfriend, but he didn't look for long. He was really tired, and as soon as he laid down and his head hit the pillow, he fell asleep. But parents of infants rarely get to sleep for very long, and just after 5 a.m., baby Tyler started wailing from his crib. Billie Jean wearily swung her feet out of the bed and onto the floor, and then set off down the hall to try to calm the baby down. Billy woke up to all the commotion, and he lay there quietly, listening to the sounds of Billie Jean heating up a bottle for Tyler. He could also hear another voice out in the kitchen. It was his father. Sometimes the house felt a bit cramped, with all of them living there together, but it filled Billy with happiness to watch his father hold little Tyler. After a few minutes, Billy heard Billie Jean changing the baby's diaper, and he heard his father saying goodbye and leaving for work. Then Billy felt Billie Jean slide back into bed next to him, and then he began to nod off again, even though he knew the alarm would soon wake him up. And it was at this point that Billy heard the sound of the sliding glass side door open. Just for a moment, he thought maybe his father must have forgotten something and come back. But then a shadowy figure suddenly loomed in the bedroom doorway, standing there completely silent and still. And even in the darkness, he could tell this was not his father. Billy suddenly was terrified, and he managed to blurt out, "What the hell?" And then everything went black. Less than an hour later, at 6:25 a.m., a friend of Billy's pulled into Billy's driveway, just like he always did on weekdays. He worked at the thread factory with Billy, and they usually carpooled. From outside, the friend could see that Billy and Billie Jean's bedroom light was on, but the friend didn't want to burst in, so he sent Billy a text, asking if he was going to work today. When Billy didn't respond, his friend went around the side of the house, and then went into the house through the sliding glass door that Billy and Billie Jean always left unlocked. He called out for Billy, but got no answer, so he used the family's landline phone in the living room to call Billy's cell phone twice. But each time, no one picked up. But just then, the friend wondered if maybe the reason Billy and Billie Jean were not responding to him was because they were sharing a private, intimate moment in their bedroom, and basically the friend had walked in on them. And so out of respect, the friend just stopped what he was doing, left the house, and figured, Billy would be in touch at some point. Almost 4 hours later, another family friend, whose name was Roy Stevens, came to Billy and Billie Jean's house to pick up some mail that Billy and Billie Jean were holding for him. And just like the friend from earlier, Roy also ended up going into their house through the unlocked glass sliding door and began calling out for Billie Jean and Billy. And when no one responded, Roy walked down the hall to the couple's bedroom and went inside. And what he saw gave him the shock of his life. Billy was lying on his back on the bed, not moving and covered in blood. Roy ran to Billy and shook his arm, but it was useless. Billy was totally lifeless. Roy began screaming, "No, no, no," over and over and over again. Then he rushed outside and yelled for his wife, who was waiting in the car, to call 911. Then Roy went back inside, and he would make an even more shocking discovery. He heard a murmur coming from the baby's bedroom, and when he went into that bedroom, he saw Billie Jean lying on the floor in a pool of blood. And there in her arms was her baby, breathing but asleep. The baby's forehead was smeared with their mother's blood. Roy couldn't believe what he was looking at, but he just reached down and scooped up the child, and then ran out of the house as fast as he could. Minutes later, paramedics reached the house, but there wasn't anything they could do for Billy and Billie Jean. The EMTs said the couple had likely been dead for hours. This was now a job for homicide detectives. Agent Scott Lott, a veteran detective with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, was one of the first law enforcement officials on the scene, and he began photographing everything he saw. He knew immediately that this was not your typical East Tennessee murder that grew out of an alcohol-fueled argument or a domestic dispute. This was something more sinister. It looked like Billy had been shot with a single bullet before he could even get out of bed, and he also had this deep gash on his throat. Lott left the bedroom and walked down the hall to the nursery, and he saw Billie Jean lying on the floor by her baby's crib. She had also been shot with a single bullet. Lott knew she had to have been killed while she was clutching her baby, and the thought of that was so disturbing and just so sad. Lott got down on his hands and knees and began to look for the actual bullet that killed Billie Jean, and he found it lodged in the baby's bouncy seat. Lott was amazed that the baby had somehow been left unhurt in all of this carnage. Aside from the murder victims themselves, Lott felt like the house seemed remarkably undisturbed. There was no sign of a struggle or a robbery or destruction of Billy and Billie Jean's property. Whoever committed these murders was very clean and efficient. After Lott's initial search of the house, he walked outside and waited for Billy's father to come home. Billy's father choked back sobs when he came roaring up to the house in his truck. He had gotten a call from a sheriff's deputy telling him what had happened at his house. He stepped out of the truck, and Detective Lott went over to meet him. Billy's father told Lott that everything had seemed perfectly normal when he left that morning. Billie Jean had been feeding the baby in the pre-dawn darkness, and he was getting ready for work. And now, just a few hours later, his whole property was marked off with yellow police tape, and his son and his son's girlfriend were dead. The old man just couldn't make any sense of it. But as Lott listened to Billy's distraught father, it dawned on him that the killer or killers must have planned the attack in great detail. Billy's dad said he left for work at 5:30 a.m., and Billy needed to go to work an hour later. That left only 1 hour when Billy and Billie Jean would have been home alone with the baby. Lott thought the chances were good that the killer or killers had been waiting in the dark outside the house for their opportunity to attack this young couple, and the thought of that just made Lott's skin crawl. By 2 p.m., the detectives were ready to release the bodies to the morgue for autopsy, and Lott was eager to start talking to people who knew the victims. His investigators had combed every square inch of the house and learned almost nothing from it. Lott didn't know whether he was dealing with a drug cartel hit or a serial killer or something else entirely. That afternoon, Lott and his partner, Chief Deputy Joe Woodard, asked one of Billie Jean's closest friends, Lindsay Thomas, to come down to the Mountain City Sheriff's Station. They hoped she might be able to provide some information about Billie Jean that could help the investigation. Lindsay had clearly been crying, but she came to the station ready to help find the killer or killers, even if that meant telling some of her friends' secrets. Lindsay said she suspected that the murders had something to do with drugs. She had visited Billie Jean at home the day before the killings, and Billie Jean had told her that she was selling opioid pills to help pay for Tyler's baby supplies. And Lindsay knew that Billie Jean's boyfriend, Billy, also sold opioid pills. And so Lindsay told Lott that between the two of them, they could have been in touch with some very dangerous people who would not hesitate to hurt or even kill them if something went wrong. This was news to Lott. Billy and Billie Jean did not have criminal records, and they were not under investigation by the narcotics squad either. But maybe the couple was just good at avoiding unwanted attention. The crime scene was certainly consistent with a ruthless drug gang hit, cold, efficient, and cruel, and Lott did find white crystals on the floor in Tyler's room that looked a lot like methamphetamines. And so Lott made a mental note to be sure to check back in with his narcotics squad. Then Lott asked about something Billy's dad had told him. When Billy's dad was sobbing in front of the house, he had made a comment about how there was some bad blood between his son and his son's girlfriend and this other family in town, the Potters. Now, Billy's father was too upset to explain this clearly, but from what Lott gathered, it sounded like there was some sort of internet feud between primarily Billie Jean and Janelle Potter, who was 30 years old and lived with her parents. Lindsay told detectives that she knew all about this feud. She said she'd even gotten caught up in it. But she thought the whole thing was just stupid. It was more like a middle school food fight than a reason to actually kill someone, and so Billy and Billie Jean were not afraid of the Potter family. I mean, they never even locked all their doors. Still, Lott asked Lindsay to slow down and walk the detectives through the entire feud. Lindsay said the dispute had begun more than a year earlier when people that she had never heard of began slamming her and Billie Jean on a website called Topics. It was a site where people commented on local issues, sometimes anonymously. One person had accused Lindsay of threatening to hurt Janelle, and he said that Janelle's defenders might hurt Lindsay too. And so he warned Lindsay to, quote, watch her back. For months, Topics users alleged that Lindsay and Billie Jean were out to get Janelle, and that they might even physically assault her. Lindsay told the detectives that she and Billie Jean had tried to ignore the taunts because the whole idea was absurd. The two women barely knew Janelle and really had no reason to want to hurt her. Lindsay said that she and Billie Jean ultimately became convinced that Janelle Potter herself was orchestrating the social media posts against them as a way to make herself look like a victim and maybe get some sympathy. Lindsay explained that Janelle was a very immature person who had never had a job, never had a driver's license, or really a real boyfriend, so she had plenty of time to stir up some trouble. Lindsay said that she and Billie Jean eventually filed harassment charges against Janelle, but a judge threw out their complaints for lack of evidence. After that, Billy got involved, and he called Janelle's mother in hopes of ending the dispute. But the mother stood by her daughter, and before long, the phone call had turned into a shouting match with Janelle crying in the background. Lott looked over at his partner Woodard, and he nodded. They both knew this was a strange lead, but it was the best thing they had so far, so they had to go talk to the Potters next. The next morning, so February 1st, the two detectives drove out to the Potters' home, located a few miles from where Billy and Billie Jean had lived and died. Janelle's father, Buddy, opened the front door even before Lott and Woodard could ring the doorbell. He would tell them that he'd actually been expecting them because everybody in town always pointed fingers at his family. Lott could see that Buddy was a very proud United States Marine. He wore a Marine Corps hat, and his living room table was covered with military honors, including decorations from combat in Vietnam. Buddy said that he and his wife had moved here from Pennsylvania a few years back after a severe fall ended Buddy's military career, and now they were just enjoying retirement. But Buddy acknowledged that their daughter, Janelle, really struggled sometimes. He explained that she had a hearing problem when she was young that made it really difficult for her to carry on normal conversations, and at 6 feet tall, she felt really awkward and struggled to talk to boys. So as the years went by, she spent more and more of her time alone at home. Buddy said that his daughter was so vulnerable that he and his wife often had to be very protective. Anybody who wanted to do something socially with Janelle had to meet Buddy and her mother, Barbara, first. And Buddy said they worried constantly that Janelle was being bullied. That's when Barbara chimed in. She said the feud between their family and Billie Jean and her friends was a perfect example of the way Janelle was bullied. Barbara said that, Billie Jean and Lindsay would pick on Janelle so regularly that she and Buddy sometimes worried that their daughter might end up hurting herself. Janelle sat quietly as her parents talked about her to the detectives. But eventually, Janelle would speak up, and she would say that she didn't understand why Billie Jean and Lindsay were targeting her. She said she never posted insults about Billie Jean or anybody else online, but some of the people who came to Janelle's defense online fiercely criticized Billie Jean and Lindsay. Janelle said she believed that Billie Jean and Billie and Lindsay were trying to make her feel completely alone. She said that Billie had also attacked her closest supporters, falsely accusing her friend, Jaime Kurd, of selling drugs. Lot's eyes widened at the mention of Jaime Kurd. He'd heard that name when interviewing people who were close to Billie. And so he stopped Janelle and he asked, "Isn't that Billie's cousin?" And Janelle nodded and said, "Yes." Lot acted surprised. Lot told Janelle he understood that Jaime and Billie were not only relatives, but also close friends. So why would Billie attack Jaime? Janelle explained that Jaime actually was no longer friends with his cousin Billie anymore because he had learned how badly Billie and Billie Jean and Lindsay were mistreating Janelle. The two detectives wrapped up the interview and thanked the Potters for their time. Then they got up and walked outside and made their way over to their car, all the while puzzling over the strange story they'd just heard. Also, Janelle's way of talking just seemed very immature to them, and not just because of her high-pitched, childlike voice, but also because she portrayed everything in terms of petty rivalries that really did seem like something from middle school. But the online harassment that Janelle and her parents described sounded very serious to Lot. And if Janelle really did look at the world like a middle school kid, she would be an easy target. So Lot could see why the Potter family was on edge at the mention of Billie and Billie Jean. Lot and Woodard agreed they needed to speak with Billie's cousin, Jaime, as soon as possible. Clearly, he had a ringside seat for the family feud, and so maybe he could give the detectives some sense of how deep the anger ran on both sides. Later that day, narcotics officers listened politely as Agent Lot described the evidence that Billie and Billie Jean were selling drugs out of their home, potentially putting their lives at risk. But the narcotics officers were not impressed. They said at most, Billie and Billie Jean were small-time dealers who were selling just to their inner circle. The narcotics officers went on to say that typically they investigated people who sold hundreds of times more product than Billie and Billie Jean. If anyone was going to get killed over a drug deal gone bad, it would likely be major dealers, not just some random young couple with a little bag of pills. Nothing the narcotics officer said surprised Lot, but the dead end left him with only one real lead in the case. Now he was even more interested in his upcoming conversation with Jaime Kurd. By the time Jaime walked into the sheriff's office on Thursday, February 2nd, so 2 days after the murder, the detectives had thoroughly scrubbed his background. They talked to friends of the victims, as well as Jamie's own sister, about Jamie's relationship with Billie and Janelle. People said that Billie was probably the best friend Jaime had ever had. The two men had worked together on the same exact machine at the thread factory, and then they often went out and partied together after the shift was over. And when Jamie's dog died a few years ago, Billie had even come over with beer to commiserate and to comfort his cousin. And when Jaime couldn't find a girlfriend, Billie had introduced him to Janelle Potter, who had just as much trouble getting a date as Jaime did. And Jaime and Janelle hit it off and began spending time together, but they had one problem. Janelle's parents did not like Jaime. At one point, they even banned him from coming inside their house. And so that was when Jaime began offering to come over and repair the Potter family's computers, because it was literally the only way he could think of that he could still see Janelle. But Jamie's relationship with Janelle ultimately drove a wedge between Jaime and his cousin Billie as the online feud spread to Facebook and other social media, and then to the courts. In the end, Jaime had to choose between his girl and his best friend, and he picked his girl, and the two men stopped speaking to each other. Now, the detectives wondered how far Jaime would go to defend Janelle. From the moment Jaime entered the police interview room, with a baseball hat pulled down low over his sleepy eyes, Lott had the sense of a man who was a follower, not a leader. Jaime himself was quick to make it clear that he was a country boy who had never strayed too far from eastern Tennessee. He said he didn't really use computers much himself, even though he was enough of a handyman to repair them, but he knew that Billy and Billie Jean were posting threats against Janelle on Facebook and other websites. And Jaime just couldn't understand why Billy would do that, or why Billy denied that it was true. Jaime said he saw firsthand the damage that Billy and Billie Jean's threats were doing to Janelle. Jaime said he had seen Janelle suffer these paralyzing panic attacks over some of the things that Billy and Billie Jean were saying about her. And Jaime said at some point he just couldn't take it. He just could not bear to watch his girl get hurt. Detective Lott said he could only imagine how hard it would be to watch your girlfriend be bullied. Jaime tried to interrupt, claiming that Janelle was not his girlfriend, but Lott ignored him. He said it must have been hard for Jaime to keep from hurting the people who were hurting Janelle. Then Lott leaned forward and looked right at Jaime, and he asked him a very surprising and blunt question. Would you shoot a woman with a baby in her arms? Startled, Jaime just sat there for a moment before he answered with one word: no. And Jaime instantly offered to take a lie detector test to prove he really had nothing to do with these murders. And after that, he went silent. And so the detectives just sat there in silence and stared at Jaime, hoping he would eventually chime in with useful information. And for a while, all Jaime did was just sit slouched in his chair, but then suddenly Jaime sat up and he began wildly looking all around the interview room as though he was looking for someone who was watching them. Then he looked right at the detectives, and his eyes were wide and his voice got really quiet, and he asked them, "Is the CIA here?" Lott and his partner were dumbfounded, but also intrigued. Why would the Central Intelligence Agency, the country's international spy agency, have anything to do with a double murder in rural Tennessee? Jaime glanced from detective to detective, hoping for an answer to his question, but the two detectives didn't say anything, mostly because this was a totally outrageous question that didn't seem legitimate. But what was absolutely clear in this moment was the two detectives knew they had to figure out what in the world Jaime was talking about. On the other side of town, Janelle's mother, Barbara, had no idea that Jaime was talking to the police at that very moment. But she would have known exactly why Jaime was asking about the CIA. And she, for one, was grateful that one particular spy did keep an eye on Mountain City, Tennessee. For more than a year, Barbara had been emailing back and forth with a CIA agent named Chris, and they had grown very close, like mother and son. In fact, she even sometimes addressed him as son. Chris, the CIA agent, had gone to high school with Janelle more than a decade earlier. And even though his career had taken him around the world since those days, he still kept a protective eye on his high school classmate, and he would let Barbara know whenever he learned of any threats to Janelle's safety. Months before the murders, in April of 2011, Chris had emailed Barbara to let her know that Billie Jean and two other women had been prowling around their property at night. Chris said he suspected the women were up to no good, but he was in no position to do anything. He had just broken his arm, and he was in a cast. However, Chris said he had tapped the phone line in Billy and Billie Jean's house, so he would be able to keep track of their conversations. That way, they would know if Billy and Billie Jean were planning anything else. Barbara couldn't thank Chris enough for the warning. He was like a guardian angel. "We love you, son," she wrote back to him. And in the email, she also reassured Chris that her husband, Buddy, was in, quote, Vietnam jungle recon mode, end quote, and he would be ready if any intruders tried to enter their home. Billy's cousin Jamie had also struck up a relationship with Chris, the CIA agent, and Jamie often poured his heart out to the spy about how much he loved Janelle. Chris had assured Jamie that he had a great girl, but he warned Jamie that Billy and Billie Jean and their friends, they really wanted to make Janelle's life hell, and that would definitely affect Jamie's life. So when Jamie returned to the police station to take his lie detector test that he requested on February 6, 2012, so almost a week after the murders, he hoped that Chris, the CIA agent, might be looking out for him. But things didn't go so well for Jamie. The lie detector analyst concluded that Jamie was being deceptive when he claimed he didn't know anything about the murders of Billy and Billie Jean. And so this meant it was very likely that Jamie was hiding something. And this was exactly what Agent Lott was hoping for. Now he'd be able to really up the pressure on Jaime and basically force him to either spill his guts or risk facing first-degree murder charges. And so, Agent Lott walked into the interview room where Jaime was once again waiting, and Lott felt ready to break this man down. For the next 2 hours, Lott, along with another detective, threw one question after another at Jaime. What was he hiding? Why was he lying? Was anyone else involved in the murders? And Jaime just sat there mumbling, I don't know, or just grumbling without even answering at all. Finally, the detectives actually started taking pity on Jaime, saying they knew he was not the mastermind. He was probably just following someone else's instructions. Lott said that maybe Jaime didn't shoot anyone, but he needed to tell them who did. But Jaime just continued to mumble and stammer his way, and so Lott was getting really frustrated. So he just left the room and typed up a written statement, a confession for Jaime to sign, that admitted he played a role in the murders. And so Lott came back in the room with the statement, and he slid the confession with a pen across the table to Jaime, and Jaime just stared at it for a long time doing nothing. But eventually, Jaime picked up the pen and he signed his name down at the bottom. After the interrogation ended, Jaime looked completely defeated, and so he very quickly just agreed to let the detectives come out to the parking lot and search his car. And in his car, scrawled on a scrap of paper on the front passenger seat, the detectives found email addresses for not only Jaime, but also for Barbara and Janelle. This was like a goldmine to Lott. Now that Jaime had confessed to a backup role in the murders, the detectives could get a search warrant to see all the messages written to and from these email addresses in the months leading up to the murders. If there was a larger plot to murder Billy and Billie Jean, then the detectives would soon know about it. A few days later, the email company sent the detectives an electronic file containing thousands of emails sent or received by Jaime, Barbara, and Janelle over the previous year. And so suddenly, the detectives had a window into why the Potter family lived in such fear. The detectives quickly started seeing correspondence from a CIA agent named Chris Chodden, who was warning with increasing urgency that Billy, Billie Jean, and their friends were harassing and threatening Janelle. The emails were chatty and personal, sometimes weaving in stories from Chris's CIA work or references to his 3 Great Danes, but frequently coming back to his concerns that these bullies might follow through on their threats to hurt Janelle. Lott couldn't believe that a CIA agent would use his official position to get involved in a family feud in rural Tennessee. The emails showed that for months in 2011, Chris had tried to get a CIA ID card for Janelle's father, Buddy, so that Buddy could acquire military-grade weapons that are normally off-limits to civilians. And so the whole thing just seemed extremely unprofessional to the detectives. So Lott and another detective decided to track down Chris and just ask him what was going on. The detectives found a guy named Chris Chodden who graduated with Janelle from a high school in Pennsylvania, and so Lott got his phone number and called him up. Chris seemed surprised to be getting a call from police in Tennessee, but he agreed to talk. And the next day, Lott and the other detective drove up from Mountain City to Delaware to meet with Chris for coffee at his house. After the detectives and Chris had taken a seat at the kitchen table, they talked for a few minutes, just kind of general niceties, and then Lott just pushed a stack of papers across the table to Chris and told him they were copies of emails that he had written to his old high school classmate, Janelle Potter. But Chris just looked blankly at the papers and then at the detectives, and he said he had never sent an email to Janelle Potter, ever. He knew her in high school, but they were never really friends and did not stay in touch after graduation. He said he didn't know what those papers were, but they had nothing to do with him. Lott then asked Chris about his work for the CIA, and Chris nearly broke out laughing. The CIA? Chris said he was a police officer, just like the 2 detectives, but he had never had anything to do with the CIA, and he certainly wasn't a spy. Lott asked Chris if he had broken his arm recently, and Chris said he had never broken it. Lott and the other detective believed Chris. He was nothing like the brash CIA agent in the emails, and he seemed genuinely surprised to be asked questions about a woman he barely knew. But now Lott needed to know, if Chris was not the author of all those emails, who was? The emails that the detectives had obtained from their search warrant were enough to fill an entire banker's box when they were printed out, and they included countless emails from Chris himself. But using them to solve a crime was another question altogether. They were not in any particular order, and they covered a wide array of subjects, from everyday trivia like Janelle's love of floppy-eared dogs to Chris's tale of international assassinations. If investigators were going to figure out Chris's true identity, they needed a specialist who could really focus and not be distracted by every twist and turn of the investigation. So they turned to a veteran state prosecutor, Dennis Brooks, who agreed to read every single email until he had a better sense of who Chris really was. For days, Brooks spent his evenings immersed in the electronic world that the Potters and Jaime shared with Chris. Brooks concluded that Chris, if nothing else, wrote like he was a homicidal maniac. In notes to Buddy, Barbara, and Jaime alike, Chris would talk about the need to eliminate Billy and Billie Jean and their friends. He closed one message in particular to the Potters with the words, "Kill, kill, kill," all in capital letters. And of course, Brooks suspected that whoever this person was, this Chris person, they did not work for the CIA. Real CIA operatives, the kind who killed people as part of their job, were notoriously secretive, and Chris was anything but. He seemed to openly brag about his most important assignments. But there was one striking thing about every single one of the notes from Chris that convinced Brooks that the real author, the real Chris, could only be one person. And that person was the mastermind behind the murders of Billy and Billie Jean, using others as unwitting pawns. The night that Jaime Kurd signed his confession, he did finally break down and talk in great detail about his role in the murders. Then, once investigators had thoroughly analyzed all the emails, they did have a clear picture of how the murders played out. And so here is a reconstruction of how police believe Billy and Billie Jean were murdered in their home on January 31st. Around midnight on January 31st, so right as Billy was crawling into bed, a few miles away, Billy and Billie Jean's killer told Jaime that they needed a favor from him. Would Jaime take a ride to Billy and Billie Jean's house and stand lookout? Jaime knew what this favor really meant. The killer was finally going to take drastic action against Billy and Billie Jean, and they needed someone else for backup. Jaime did not like this idea, but he had known this night was coming for months, and so he agreed to go. So Jaime and the killer drove to a church that was near Billy and Billie Jean's house, where they could see whoever left or entered, and they waited. Eventually, they saw the light go on as Billie Jean brought her baby into the kitchen for a bottle. Then they saw Billy's father packing his lunch for work, and then walking out the door around 5:30 a.m. This was the moment they were waiting for, when Billy and Billie Jean were all alone with just their baby in the house. Now, the couple was going to get what was coming to them. Jaime and the killer put on gloves, and then the killer gave Jaime a handgun so they'd both be armed. Then the killer and Jaime got out of the car, they made their way over to Billy and Billie Jean's house, and the killer slid open the unlocked glass doors on the side of the house, and then they walked inside and headed straight for Billy and Billie Jean's bedroom. Once the killer reached the bedroom, they stood in the doorway to gather their courage for a moment, and then they entered the room. And as soon as they did, Billy woke up and he yelled out, "What the hell?" But the killer was on top of Billy before he could do anything. And the killer put their gun just inches from Billy's face and fired. At this point, Billie Jean, who's right next to Billy, began to scream and she ran out of the room, but she didn't get far because Jaime was standing guard in front of the door that would lead outside. So Billie Jean couldn't escape. Instead, she ran down the hallway to her baby's room and pulled him out of the crib and held him close to her body. And then the killer just stepped into the room, rushed at Billie Jean, they raised their gun and shot her point blank in the side of the head. Billie Jean crumpled onto the floor, still clutching her baby. The killer simply turned around, walked back into the hall, and headed back to the main bedroom. And there, they walked back over to Billy, and just to make sure he was dead, the killer drew a knife and slit Billy's throat ear to ear. Then the killer walked out of the bedroom and met Jaime at the front door. Jaime gave his gun back to the killer and then ran outside to vomit. And that was it. The intruders got back in their car and sped off. They were in and out of the house in less than 3 minutes, leaving behind 2 dead bodies and a baby who would grow up without parents. But the killer was satisfied with what they had done. At least now his daughter, Janelle, would be safe. Buddy Potter, Janelle's father, killed Billy and Billie Jean. But police did not believe he was the one who actually set the murders in motion, or that he was the one pretending to be the mysterious CIA agent, Chris. Still, police easily had enough evidence to arrest Buddy, and they hoped that once they had him in custody, he would confirm that somebody else had pushed him to kill. But Buddy owned dozens of guns, and he often carried them no matter what he was doing, whether he was mowing the grass or out at a restaurant, he was always carrying. So when Agent Lott and Chief Deputy Woodard drove out to the Potter house early on a mid-February morning to arrest Buddy, they called ahead to let Buddy know they were just coming by with some follow-up questions. The last thing the 2 detectives wanted was to surprise Buddy and accidentally trigger an armed standoff. When they got there, Buddy let the 2 detectives into the house, but the moment Lott told him they were actually there to arrest him for murder, Buddy reached for a gun. But Lott and Woodard were ready, and they instantly tackled Buddy, pinning his arms and getting him into handcuffs. Then they dragged him outside, put him in the cruiser, and went back to the sheriff's office. On the ride, the detectives told Buddy they knew that he loved his family and he was just trying to protect them. He was no monster. After all, Buddy didn't kill the baby. The detectives reassured Buddy that they understood. The world was going to hell, and sometimes violence was the only solution, right? After all, someone else had warned Buddy his daughter was in danger. And with that, tears began to well up in Buddy's eyes in the backseat of the cruiser, and his voice cracked as he shared with the detectives all the terrible things the CIA agent Chris had told him that Billy and Billie Jean were going to do to his daughter. And it was just too much for him. He had to act. Now, while Buddy clearly missed all the red flags in the emails coming from the CIA agent Chris that clearly indicated he was not who he said he was, the state prosecutor, Dennis Brooks, who reviewed all those emails, he caught the red flags, and it was one particular red flag, a chronic error that popped up in many of the emails, that ultimately led Brooks to discover the fake CIA agent's true identity. Time and again in these emails, Chris made a spelling mistake that was far more typical for a school child than an adult CIA agent. Chris always forgot to drop the letter E from the end of verbs when he added the letters ing to them. So words like loving, taking, and caring all contained the extra E in the middle. And that was the same error that Brooks had seen over and over again when reading emails sent from another person, Janelle Potter. And so Brooks told investigators that Chris had been a figment of Janelle's imagination all along, but one that she had used to very effectively manipulate her entire family. Janelle had basically catfished her own family into believing that she was in mortal danger, and ultimately, that caused her father to go out and kill Billy and Billie Jean. A year and a half later, Buddy Potter, Janelle's father, was found guilty of killing Billy and Billie Jean and was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences. As for Jaime Kurd, the star prosecution witness, he agreed to a plea deal that required him to serve 25 years in prison. Janelle and her mother Barbara went on trial for their roles in promoting the double murder. Janelle's attorney argued that she was too childlike to murder anyone, and she shouldn't be punished because her father was overly protective. But the jury was not buying it, and ultimately she and her mother were both sentenced to life in prison. It was Monday, March 20th, 1995, and Japan's capital city of Tokyo was waking up to a truly beautiful early spring day. By the end of the month, the city's famous cherry blossom trees would be in bloom, attracting thousands of visitors and residents to the cherry blossom festivals that would pop up in half a dozen places throughout what is the largest urban center in the world. But on that particular morning, many of those who worked in Tokyo, like 26-year-old airline employee Kiyoka Izumi, were not happy when they heard their alarms going off. The day before had been Sunday, so a day off, and the next day, Tuesday, was also a day off because it was the national holiday celebrating the spring equinox. But that day, Monday, was just a regular workday. And so when Kyoka rolled out of her bed at 6:15 a.m., she felt super annoyed that her employer hadn't just given them the day off to make it a long weekend. To make matters worse, as soon as Kyoka actually got out of bed, she immediately felt sick. Nothing major, but she just felt groggy and a little out of it, and she briefly thought about calling out of work, and considering how uninspired she already felt about working that day, the option sounded like a pretty good one, but ultimately, she decided to suck it up and head in with the rest of her coworkers. After all, Kyoka did like her job. She found working for the airline industry was far more exciting than her previous job was, which had been working for one of Japan's major train companies, Japan Railway. And she figured getting up and moving around might actually make her feel better. So instead of going back to sleep, Kyoka headed for the shower, then she got dressed and downed her usual quick cup of coffee. Then she headed out the door and began speedwalking to the closest subway station. Once she got there, she would catch the first of 3 trains that would take her from her home in northwest Tokyo to her office in the southeastern part of Japan's capital. As Kyoka walked, the last of the light purple plum blossoms that always bloomed at the end of February reminded her again of tomorrow's spring holiday. Her spirits lifting, she glanced at the time, and despite getting a slower than usual start that morning, she'd left the house at about 7:50 a.m., she still was on track to get to her office right before the day began at 8:30. A few minutes later, Kyoka got to the entrance of the local train station. She was lucky because the timing of her daily commute meant that she always missed the absolute height of Tokyo's morning rush hour, where the subways would get so crowded with people, subway attendants in uniforms and caps literally pushed people and their bags into the train cars just so the doors could close. But even at its most crowded, and the Tokyo subway carried more than twice as many riders as the New York City subway, Tokyo actually has one of the safest, most efficient subway systems in the world. Walk into a Tokyo subway at any hour of the day, and you will not see people sleeping on benches or warming up on top of heating grates. You won't see trash, you won't see graffiti. It will be pristine. The same subway attendants who push people onto the trains also spend a large amount of their time patrolling the subway to pick up trash and make sure everything is always spotless. Kyoka turned off the sidewalk and headed down the stairs into the less than crowded subway station below. She swiped her train pass and then stepped through the turnstile out onto the train platform. A few minutes later, the first train she would take arrived, and she stepped on board and she grabbed a seat near the doors. The doors shut a few moments later, and off the train went, rumbling into the dark tunnel ahead. 5 stops later, Kyoka stepped off of that train and walked across to the other side of the station platform, where she stood idly waiting to catch the next train. A few minutes later, that train would arrive. It was train A725K, and it pulled into the station right in front of her. This train would take her all the way to Government Center, which is right in the center of Tokyo, and is one of the busiest train stations in all of Japan. When the doors of train A725K opened, Kyoka stepped aboard and once again felt lucky she was missing rush hour, because the train, it was crowded, but not so crowded that pushers would be required to get everyone on board. Most of the seats were taken, but Kyoka could see a clearing towards the front of the car where she'd be able to stand. And so as she began walking in that direction, she nodded to a few familiar faces but didn't have any conversations with anyone. Tokyo subway etiquette included never littering, not making any commotion, and not talking too loudly, or really at all. And this morning, that suited Kyoka just fine. She really did not feel like talking anyway. When she reached the clearing in the front of the car, she grabbed onto a handrail above her head, and she watched as the doors closed, and then she felt the train begin to lurch forward. When Kyoka left that morning, she had hoped her morning commute would wake her up and make her feel better, but as she stood there on this second train, A725K, she couldn't help but notice that she actually was starting to feel worse. As this train slowly rumbled on in the darkness, Kyoka closed her eyes and took a deep breath in to try to reduce the nausea that was starting to come on. But as her lungs filled, she suddenly felt this excruciating pain in her chest. It was so blindingly painful and so sudden that she instinctively let go of the handrail and grabbed at her chest with both of her hands, almost causing her to fall over, given the fact that the train was moving. She breathed out forcibly and then gagged as if the air she had just inhaled was the source of the pain, but even with her lungs now empty, her chest still ached. But just as quickly as the pain had started, it stopped. And when it did, she fumbled again for the handrail above her head, and once she had a firm grasp on it and she was steady on her feet, she told herself that, that pain had probably just been connected to stress, as her grandfather had passed away recently, and she was very upset about that. And so she was thinking, okay, that could be why. Or maybe it was connected to her just not feeling very good that morning to begin with. Maybe this is just her being sick. But after she was able to kind of talk herself down and convince herself that this was not a big deal, something else registered to her, which was she had just grabbed at her chest and started gagging, and very obviously it just kind of made this scene. People are going to be staring at her and wondering now if she's okay. And so Kyoka starts to feel super embarrassed as she's still kind of looking down, and she's imagining that when she looks up, there's going to be all these commuters staring at her, waiting to see, is she okay or not? And so Kyoka, eventually, she does look up, and she's anticipating kind of like waving to people and kind of signaling that she was okay now. But when she looked up, she was kind of surprised at what she saw. Because when she looked around into the train car, no one was looking at her. And the reason was, everyone in the train, everyone was coughing. No one was paying attention to her. All they were doing was trying to cover their mouths as they all coughed. So everyone's got their jackets over their faces, and they have their elbows up over their mouths. And Kyoka's just kind of looking around, wondering what the heck is going on. And then she felt her own throat start to tighten, and she started to cough. And as Kyoka tried to shield her own mouth, she noticed the people around her had gone from a somewhat mild cough to a violent one. Some people were coughing so aggressively they could not catch their breath, and you could see panic on their faces as they don't know what to do. They're not able to breathe. But despite this totally insane coughing phenomenon that was taking place on board this train car, the train just rumbled on and continued making all of its scheduled stops. And as new commuters clambered on board, they too began to cough. By the time the train pulled into Government Center, Kyoka's stop, virtually everyone was now violently coughing and keeled over. People had given up trying to shield their mouths at this point. It was just too out of control. And by now, basically everyone had decided they were just going to get off the train, whether Government Center was their stop or not. And so there was a throng of people that were kind of pressed up against the doors, waiting for the doors to open. And so when the train finally did come to a full stop and the doors opened up, a wave of coughing commuters rushed out onto the station platform, the sound of their hacking and gagging filling the air. And so Kyoka, she was towards the back of this group of people leaving the train. And as she was leaving, right as she's about to go out of the train doors, she glances down the length of the train car she is in, and she sees some of the passengers are pointing at something on the ground while yelling for subway attendants to come have a look. But Kyoka, from where she was standing, she couldn't see what they were pointing at. And because she wanted fresh air so badly, she was not about to stay on the train to figure out what it is. And so Kyoka, she gets off of the train, and as soon as she does, even though she is still coughing, as is everybody else around her, her mind is entirely focused on hustling over to the stairs that will bring her downstairs to the final train platform where she will catch the final third train that will bring her on her way to work. Because at this point, even though she has no idea why everybody is coughing, Kyoka is only viewing this coughing fit as a nuisance, not as an emergency. But as Kyoka moved towards these stairs, she suddenly felt extremely nauseous, and she rushed into a nearby women's bathroom in case she needed to throw up. Once she was inside, she resisted the urge to vomit, and then she splashed some water on her face, and then after kind of composing herself, she headed back out onto the station platform, and still her mind is focused on just getting to work. And so she begins walking over to the stairs again. But she'd only gone maybe a few steps before an alarm sounded inside of the subway, and then a voice came over the subway intercom telling everyone to evacuate. Having worked for Japan Railways previously, Kyoka had been educated about this particular alarm that she was hearing. She was told it was never used for anything other than true emergencies, so she knew whatever was going on had to be bad. Right around the time that Kyoka was getting ready to leave for her daily commute to work, 48-year-old Ikuyo Hayashi was also getting ready for work. Hayashi was part of Japan's highly educated and financially successful super elite. He was a gifted and well-respected surgeon who was known for being extremely devoted to his patients. On that particular Monday, like Kyoka, Dr. Hayashi had gotten up early. But shortly after starting his typical morning routine, he noticed he was sweating a little bit and his heart rate was elevated. For a second, he felt concerned, but he chalked it up to stress and kept getting ready. Just before 7:30 a.m., he headed to the front door. Before stepping into the cold morning air, he patted his coat pockets to make sure he had everything. Then, despite the clear forecast for the rest of the day, he grabbed an umbrella leaning up against the front door, and then he stepped outside and made his way to the curb where a car was waiting for him. Dr. Hayashi climbed into the back seat, and then after exchanging hellos with the driver, a 31-year-old named Tomomitsu Nimi, the two men headed for the station where Dr. Hayashi would catch train A725K. But along the way, they made one stop at a local convenience store. Dr. Hayashi and Nimi got out of the car and went inside. Hayashi put a few odds and ends that he needed on the counter, and Nimi put a couple of newspapers on the counter as well. After Dr. Hayashi had paid for it all, the two men left the store together, they got back into the car, and by 7:48 a.m., Dr. Hayashi was stepping aboard the same compartment of train A725K as Kyoka. After dropping off the doctor and wishing him luck, Nimi had pulled away from the station entrance and headed straight for the train station located just 3 stops further down the line. As soon as he stepped on board train A725K, Dr. Hayashi reached up to adjust the gauze mask he was wearing over his nose and mouth. The mask was a fixture on the Tokyo subway, especially in the cold and flu season when passengers wore them to prevent the spread of germs in the crowded subway compartments. He moved over to an empty seat, and before sitting down, he patted his coat pockets again to make sure he had all of his things. And then as he sat down, he saw sitting across from him was a woman and what appeared to be her young daughter sitting next to her. The woman was looking down, avoiding eye contact, but the young girl was looking up with a smile on her face. She was just too young to realize staring was rude. The doctor smiled back at her, but then quickly looked away. A few seconds later, the doors of the train closed, and the car began rumbling down the tracks. 3 stops later, Dr. Hayashi stood up, but before he got off, he paused for a moment in front of his seat. As he stood there, he noticed the girl was staring at him again. He looked at her, but only for a second. Then, after patting his coat pockets for a 3rd time, he quickly strode out of the train car and onto the station platform. He moved quickly to a nearby trash can and pulled the mask off of his face and disposed of it. Then, forcing himself not to hurry, Dr. Hayashi climbed the steps to the street where Nimi, his driver, was waiting for him by the curb. Immediately after the doctor got off the train, the little girl who had been sitting in front of him noticed a pile of newspapers underneath the seat where the doctor had just been sitting. Even as a youngster, she knew littering was strictly forbidden, and she wondered if the doctor or someone else had left it there. As she stared at this newspaper, she noticed a wet spot starting to form in the center of it, like the paper was sitting on top of a liquid and it was starting to seep through. As she stared, her eyes began to water and then she began to cough. Her mother turned to see if her daughter was okay, but before she could offer the child any help or comfort, she too began to cough. And then, just a few feet away from them at the front of the car, Kyoka felt that sharp shooting pain in her chest and nearly fell over, and then she too started to cough. But despite all of the coughing, the train kept rumbling on, headed for Japan's government center, where 3 major subway lines all converged. And as commuters shuffled on and off of train A725K, they pushed the now soaking wet newspaper aside with the toes of their shoes. They also stepped in what looked like an oily residue around the wet newspapers, tracking it up and down the compartment and out onto the train platforms. When the train finally reached the government center and Kyoka got off along with most of the others, some of the passengers stayed on board to point out the wet newspapers to subway attendants on the platform, hoping they could come clean them up. After getting off of the train, Kyoka felt nauseous and rushed to the bathroom. Right before she walked into the women's room, she passed by 24-year-old subway attendant Masura Yuasa, who had just finished a 24-hour shift and was getting ready to go home. The pair didn't know each other and probably didn't even see each other when they passed, but before the day was over, they would be forever bound by tragedy. Masura really liked his job with the Tokyo Metro, and despite looking like he was still in high school, he actually had worked as a subway attendant for 7 years. As he passed by Kyoka, he heard people coughing on the platform, but it wasn't something that really registered to him. He was only thinking about going home and going to bed because he was exhausted from his overnight shift. As he moved along the platform, he saw his chief suddenly coming out of an office with a mop in his hand. And so intrigued, Masura asked him, what's up with the mop? And his chief would tell him that there had been some sort of liquid spill on one of the trains, and whatever it was had apparently been tracked all over the train, and now it was out all over the station platform, and so he needed to go and clean it up. Masura didn't actually need to help him. His shift was over, but he told his chief that he'd go along and he'd help out. So Masura and his chief walked together down the platform, and as they walked, they both started to notice that just about every commuter they passed was coughing. But neither Masura nor his chief addressed it, they just kept on walking. Eventually, they saw 3 of their fellow subway attendants straight ahead, standing in the middle of the platform. 2 of the men were holding in their hands the wet newspapers that had been inside train A725K, and a 3rd man who was next to them was opening up a trash bag. And as the 2 men who were holding the newspaper were waiting for this bag to be opened, oily liquid seemed to be pouring off of the newspaper's edges onto the ground. And in fact, there was a long, oily trail on the ground from wherever these papers had been carried from all the way to that platform. And so as soon as Masura and the chief walked up in front of these 3, the chief noticed the huge oily puddle right underneath them, and he saw the trail, and so he got to work trying to mop up this oil all over the ground. And Masura, he didn't really have a job to do. He didn't have a mop, and he didn't have a bag or anything, so he just stood there watching. And as he stood there, it really started to sink in that virtually everyone on the platform now was violently coughing. And some people were even leaned up against the wall vomiting. And so Masura was so confused by what he was seeing, but before he could even ask his coworkers what was going on, his throat started to tighten up. And then right as Masura began coughing, he saw one of his coworkers collapse. It was the older man named Mr. Takahashi. He was the one who had had the plastic bag, which was now full of the wet newspapers. And right as Mr. Takahashi fell, to Masura, it felt like all hell had suddenly broken loose. He and the others who were around Mr. Takahashi rushed over to him to see if they could help him, and right as they're standing over him, loosening his tie and asking him if he is okay, the alarm goes off and the call over the intercom to evacuate comes out. Masura was just in shock, and for a second he just stood there frozen. But then he shook himself out of it and he ran for a phone on the wall that the subway staff would use. And he pushed the button that would call to the office that was upstairs, and when somebody picked up on the other line, Masura had to yell because of the alarm and all the coughing people and people screaming and panicking all around him. And so Masura was able to yell out into the phone that someone needed to bring a stretcher down to the platform he was on for Mr. Takahashi, who has collapsed, and someone needs to call an ambulance for Mr. Takahashi. And so after Masura communicates this over the phone, he hangs up and he runs back over to the crowd of his coworkers and Mr. Takahashi. And then just a minute later, a subway attendant comes charging down the stairs. He's got a stretcher in hand, and he, along with Masura and the other coworkers, they put Mr. Takahashi on this stretcher and they lift him up and they begin carefully moving him through this very panicked throng of commuters trying to evacuate that are coughing and vomiting. And so as they're moving, Masura, who's holding onto the stretcher, he turns back and he yells at the man who had come down with the stretcher. He says to him, "Hey, you called the ambulance. Where are they going to meet us?" Because upstairs, there were several exits out of Government Center. And so unless the ambulance knew where to pick them up, it would be nearly impossible to sync up with them. And so Masura's looking back at this coworker of his, waiting for an answer, but this coworker is staring at Masura with his eyes wide, totally glazed over. And then suddenly this guy just collapses to the ground. He lets go of the stretcher and falls to the ground and starts convulsing and shaking. And so Masura and the others put Mr. Takahashi down to deal with this new casualty. And as they did, Masura's chief, as well as the other 2 men who had been holding the newspapers, they begin to uncontrollably vomit. And so suddenly Masura is the only one who is not violently ill or in some way hurt. And so even though he had no idea what was going on and it's absolute chaos all around him, he did know he had to act right now. And so he yelled at this group he was with, who probably didn't even hear him, that he was going to go upstairs, he was going to find this ambulance and figure out what exit they needed to bring Mr. Takahashi to. And then he turned and began trying to run up the stairs as fast as he could, even though he was totally surrounded by panicked commuters trying to get out as well. But eventually he got to the top of the stairs, at which point he ran through the crowd toward the nearest doors that would bring him outside. And as soon as he pushed the doors open, he couldn't believe what he saw. There were people outside on the ground everywhere. People were coughing and vomiting, and he could hear sirens, ambulance sirens everywhere. But there was no ambulance outside waiting for Mr. Takahashi. And so he's thinking to himself, how is this ambulance not here? Where are these other ambulances going? What is going on? And so Masura couldn't help but think something really bad was happening across his city. And so he stood there for a minute wondering what he should do, and then he just decided, I have to go back down and just get Mr. Takahashi up here. We'll find the ambulance, but I gotta get him up here. And so even though he was starting to feel very sick, very nauseous, he turns and just charges back into the station. Below ground, Kyoka was coming to the same realization that something very bad must be happening to them. When she left the bathroom and began running up the stairs to the street after the alarm went off, she had looked behind her at some point, and through the sea of people, she could clearly see bodies lying on the ground, on the platform, and on the stairs. And as she ran, people to her left and to her right were crumpling to the ground, vomiting and convulsing. Finally, she managed to get upstairs and she ran toward the same exit doors that Masura had just gone through moments before her. And when she looked outside, her mind froze. The streets looked like a battlefield. People were violently convulsing on the sidewalk. There were people with spoons in their mouths, which she would later learn was to keep them from swallowing their tongues. She also saw men in business suits lying in flower beds, staring straight up into the sky without blinking. One elderly man was foaming at the mouth. And so as she stood there shocked, Masura, along with the other very sick subway attendants, they had rallied their strength and lifted Mr. Takahashi up on his stretcher, and they had brought him upstairs, and so they came barging out the doors right next to her, and then they placed Mr. Takahashi down kind of right in front of Kyoka. And Kyoka, she doesn't know who these people are, but she found herself just staring at them, and she watched as Masura ran up right next to Mr. Takahashi, and he was holding his hand, and he's kind of crying and trying to talk to Mr. Takahashi, and Masura is yelling out for someone to help him find an ambulance. And so Kyoka, she's kind of in shock and she's just staring at everything going on, not sure what to do. But then she kind of snaps out of it and she hears Masura and she decides, okay, I'm going to help him find an ambulance. And so she yells to Masura that she's going to go find his ambulance. And so she runs all the way down to the street, which was not far from the exit of the subway station. And when she was in the road, she heard the sirens everywhere. They were all over Tokyo, but there were none near them. But Kyoka noticed there was this news van that had just pulled up and all these news people had hopped out and they had their cameras up and they're filming the exits of the subway station. And Kyoka just suddenly felt furious and she screamed at them to stop filming, help us. And so the news crew, they kind of sensed the gravity of the situation, even though they really had no idea what was going on. And they said to Kyoka, what can we do? And she said, stay right there. You're going to drive someone to the hospital. And then Kyoka ran back to Masura and she got him and his coworkers to lift up Mr. Takahashi. And they went down to the news van and they loaded Mr. Takahashi into the back of the news van. And Kyoka would give Masura her handkerchief. And she says, look, hang this out the window and wave it the whole time. They're going to drive you to the hospital. People will see you waving that and they will know it's an emergency. And so Masura thanked her and he and all of his coworkers hopped in the van with the news crew and they headed off. Mr. Takahashi would unfortunately die before they reached the hospital. By now, it was obvious to basically everyone in Tokyo that something horrible had happened inside of the subway, but nobody knew what it was. However, when the truth was finally uncovered, people had a very hard time believing it. Earlier that morning, just before Dr. Hayashi got off of train A725K, he stood up in front of his seat and momentarily paused. As he stood there, he acted like he was patting his coat down one more time to make sure he had all of his belongings, but he wasn't really doing that. He was using that innocent-seeming gesture to shake loose a folded-up newspaper that was inside of his jacket. It was the same newspaper that his driver had purchased at the convenience store with him that morning. And once it was loose, it fell from the inside of his jacket down onto the ground right next to Dr. Hayashi's right foot. And Dr. Hayashi, he acted like he didn't know he had just done that. He kind of ignored the newspaper on the ground. The only person on the train who seemed to be paying any attention to him was the little girl who was sitting in front of him. As he stood, Dr. Hayashi looked at her, but only for a moment before he looked away. Then he carefully, but forcefully, pushed the sharpened tip of his umbrella straight down into the newspaper that he had just dropped. He did this several times without looking down before finally hustling off the train. Wrapped up inside of the newspaper he dropped were two identical plastic packets that almost resembled dishwasher soap pods. Inside of these packets was a liquid form of one of the most deadly nerve toxins in the world, sarin gas. And when Dr. Hayashi jabbed his umbrella into the newspaper, he was attempting to puncture those packets because as soon as that liquid was exposed to the air, it would vaporize and become sarin gas. He was only able to puncture one of the two packets, but that was more than enough. Developed by the Nazis in 1937, sarin is among the most toxic of any known chemical warfare agent. Within seconds of exposure, sarin disrupts the normal activity of our neurotransmitters, basically sending our nervous system into overdrive. Your muscles start to convulse and twitch, your normal bodily secretions go crazy, so you start to cough and you can't stop. Tears come pouring out of your eyes, your pupils contract until they're like pinpoints, your nose starts running, you drool and vomit. As neurotransmitters keep telling your nerves to go, 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 your bowels and bladder evacuate themselves. And because sarin has no taste or smell, the people near it in the Tokyo subway had absolutely no idea what was happening to them. Instead, they felt the stabbing pain as their chest tightened. They started to feel nauseous, their vision blurred. Depending on the purity and strength of the sarin gas and the type of exposure, those symptoms could intensify, progressing to convulsions, paralysis, and death within 1 to 10 minutes. After fleeing the train and making it back to street level, Dr. Hayashi quickly got into the waiting car with Nimi, his driver, and the pair started driving west. Their next destination was a large swath of desolate land located near the foot of Mount Fuji, an active volcano about 65 miles outside of Tokyo. As soon as the car broke free of Tokyo traffic, Nimi started to speed up. Soon they both had a clear view of Mount Fuji, its peak covered in snow, and then about an hour later, the men had arrived at their destination. They pulled up to a collection of run-down-looking buildings surrounded by a high chain-link fence. As soon as Nimi had parked the car inside of the compound, Dr. Hayashi opened the car door and walked toward one of these smaller buildings. Once inside, he walked straight through what looked like a waiting room to a back door. He took a deep breath and then he opened that door, and inside was this smaller office, and there were 8 men inside of it. Dr. Hayashi stepped inside with Nimi close behind him, and they took up their spot on the right side of the room, standing shoulder to shoulder with the other men, and just like everyone else, they waited in silence. A few minutes later, the door at the back of this inner office opened, and a 40-year-old man named Shoko Asahara came in. He was a stocky man with black hair down to his shoulders, and he had a black beard that reached halfway down his chest. When he stopped in front of Dr. Hayashi, Nimi, and the other 8 assembled men, he stared at them through his gray eyes. After a few tense moments, a man standing next to Dr. Hayashi nervously stepped forward, and he looked at Shoko, and he just said, "Mission accomplished." It would turn out Dr. Hayashi and every other person in that room and nearly 50,000 other people at the time were part of a doomsday cult called Om Shinrikyo, which means Supreme Truth, and Shoko was their leader. Initially, Shoko had founded Om Shinrikyo to preach a mashup of Hinduism, Buddhism, meditation, and natural healing, and he was extremely good at recruiting people to join, attracting many members of Japan's super elite like Dr. Hayashi. And once people joined, it was like they fell under Shoko's spell. And soon they would become obsessed with him, doing things like drinking his bathwater to try to get closer to him, or wearing electrically charged hats they believed would synchronize their thoughts with his. And so when Shoko shifted gears and decided Om Shinrikyo needed to focus less on spirituality and healing, and instead focus on starting World War III in order to cleanse the world, none of his extremely well-educated followers, like Dr. Hayashi, objected. Instead, they said, "How can we help?" And so, on March 20th, 1995, Dr. Hayashi, along with 4 other cult members that were in that room with him, carried sarin gas packets into the Tokyo subway and dropped and punctured them in strategic locations to ensure the gas spread as far as possible. And then afterwards, they ran back to the streets where their drivers were waiting to take them away. And all of the drivers were in this room as well. Shoko hoped this attack would somehow prompt World War III and collapse the Japanese government, but it didn't do that. However, it did kill 13 people and injured 5,000 people. Amazingly, this was not the first sarin gas attack carried out by this cult. A year earlier, Shoko had orchestrated another sarin attack on a quiet Japanese neighborhood that killed 8 people and injured more than 300, but at the time, no one knew the cult was responsible. On May 16, 1995, so nearly 1 month after the sarin attack in the Tokyo subway, authorities would figure out the previous attack was carried out by Shoko and his cult, and this one was carried out by them as well. And so they would track down and arrest Shoko Asahara. He was discovered in a secret compartment between the 2nd and 3rd floors of the Mount Fuji headquarters. He was dressed in purple robes and meditating at the time of his arrest. In the weeks, months, and years that followed, police would track down and charge 200 cult members in connection with the subway attack and in connection with other crimes and murders. Dr. Hayashi, whose sarin packets were directly responsible for 2 deaths, along with hundreds of injuries, cooperated with the police, giving up information about the cult. In exchange for this information, he was spared the death penalty and given life in prison. 123 cult members would be given the death penalty, including Dr. Hayashi's driver, Nimi, and the cult's leader, Shoko Asahara. Kyoka and Masura would both survive the Tokyo subway sarin gas attack. Masura would spend 3 days in the hospital, but after he was discharged, he would go right back to work. And Kyoka, she initially did not go to the hospital, sticking around to help people as much as she could. But later that day, she would get very, very sick, and she would stay that way for several weeks, but she would eventually make a full recovery. Thank you for listening to the Mrballen podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you haven't done this already, please take a picture of the 5-star review button's lawn ornaments and then post that picture along with their street address on Craigslist with the caption "free." Also, please subscribe to the Mrballen podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and everywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called Mrballen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @Mrballen, and I really do read the majority of my